Hi, welcome to this video about motor learning and motor skill development in volleyball. This is part of the Storm Volleyball Club's coach development program, which is being developed and organised by Nicole Hannon and Phil Kelly and myself. We're not professional video makers, so this is pretty basic, but we just want to give you some ideas that you can have before you come to some of our coach development courses, or perhaps you might want to go back to again later. Here's some of the things we cover. First of all, a bit of background. Secondly, something about the principles of motor learning. Thirdly, we'll look at cues and feedback and the things you can say as a coach. And then fourthly, we'll look at some applications. This is just an introduction, and hopefully we'll get lots of chances to talk about this, as this is foundational to our work as not just volleyball coaches, coaches in any sport or physical activity really, but here we're going to talk specifically about volleyball. So first of all, in the background, the thing is, it's about motor learning, but we learn all the time. It's not like we turn up to training or a game and we start learning. We're always learning. We might be doing things specifically related to volleyball. We might be watching it. We might be listening to watching a YouTube video or something, or we might be talking to friends. But people who are interested in volleyball or any other movement activity, you're learning all the time. It's not something that starts and finishes. And learning doesn't always involve a teacher or a coach. You know, you can learn a lot just by looking at something. So learning and teaching are not the same thing. Sometimes a teacher can help learning, and sometimes, in fact, a teacher can get in the way. The other background thing we need to consider is there's no one perfect technique. There's lots of techniques that are effective, and we'll talk through these shortly. And every time you perform a skill, it's new. So the first one, we're learning all the time. And if you think about when you're a child, you have teachers, but they don't directly teach you things. We don't know really about children, but it's probably likely they don't understand things we talk to them about because they don't have the language skills. They haven't learned those yet. So how do they learn them? Well, again, think back to some of the hardest things you've ever learned in your whole life, and probably the hardest thing you've ever learned is to talk and communicate. Who taught you? Your parents didn't really teach you. The people around you didn't teach you. You just were involved, and all of a sudden you picked it up. There were no formal lessons about it. Or how to walk. So we might have created environments to encourage our children to learn to walk. We might have held them up and had someone close to them they could walk to, but we didn't actually give them direct instructions like pick up your foot and put it down, pick up your other foot and put that down. They learned it by just trial and error and by observing people around them. So it's not necessary to tell everyone how to do something. In fact, often the things you need to learn, and particularly about motor learning and things, are best learned through experiment and trying things out. The other thing is there's no one perfect technique. If you look at these two pictures here, both of these people are bowling a cricket ball at the highest level you can play cricket. And yet you look at them, they look radically different. Now this is what we'd consider a relatively closed skill, in the sense that you have the ball in your hand, you run in and you bowl it. But you can see within the rules of the game, these people have interpreted it radically different to come up with completely different techniques and results. Now this is not to say there aren't bad techniques, but there's a whole range of techniques which are acceptable and effective. And so we've got to be careful about just developing technique rather than skill and motor performance. If you want to have a volleyball example, you can look at these guys here. These are possibly two of the best beach volleyballs that have ever played the game. Certainly the one on the left is the greatest volleyball player widely regarded ever, that's Karch Karai. And I want you to look at his hands when he's passing. You'll see he's not got the standard technique that we'd tend to teach all the kids. And if you look at the other one there, that's St. John Smith, who's regarded as the best passer ever. And if you look at his hands, he's certainly not holding, his thumbs together, fingers crossed in that standard position we teach kids all the time. So even here at the highest level, the best players are not using the correct technique as we would describe it. So we've got to help athletes to develop working techniques that rather than the perfect technique. There's a range of techniques that are effective, but certainly not anything goes. You'll notice that none of these guys have their arms crossed over, for example. If you want another example, this is Phil Dowhauser, and he's one of the greatest attackers we've had in beach volleyball. We teach these steps to spiking. Well, he jumps off the wrong foot. So technically he does it badly because he's a goofy footer, we would call him, or he jumps off the wrong foot every single time. And yet he seems to have been reasonably effective. Incidentally, if you look at Karch Karai, he could jump off either foot. He changed it depending on what he wanted to do it in a particular moment. So technique is important, but there isn't just one technique. The third point I want to make here, is that every skill performance is different and new. Every single time you play a shot or do something, it's different. It's never the same. So this is a quote from a reasonable tennis player, Rafael Nadal, and he says something like, if you can read it for yourself, but you'd think after millions and millions of shots I would have perfected the one technique. But what he says is every single time I play a shot, it's different. It's come from a different opponent, it's bounced a different height, I'm standing in a different position. So every single shot is different. So this idea of drilling and getting muscle memory to develop a perfect technique is a fallacy, because you can't do the perfect technique every time. You've got to learn to respond to your environment and perform it appropriately every single time. So it's about problem solving. All right, that's a bit of background. If you want some more information, see Nick or Phil or myself or even Chris in the club, and we can help you with some more ideas. The second thing that's part of this introduction and background is the purpose of practice. When we go to practice, we're practicing or training to perform or compete. Yet sometimes what it looks like in our practices is we're practicing and training so we can practice or train well, because we want to have really good training sessions. But in fact, training and practice sessions should be full of mistakes and errors as we push people to develop skills, to try new things, to problem solve to different environments, rather than getting them to practice what they can already do over and over again. So a good practice is one where people make mistakes. It's where people push the boundaries. It's where people try and solve new problems that they haven't done before. A good practice isn't one where every single time we execute it's perfect. Now sometimes you might want to have a simpler practice where you are building confidence, say before a competition or something. But if a practice and training session is about improvement and learning, then it should be messy. All right, part 2, some principles of motor learning. How do people learn to move? And again, here's an outline of some of the things we'll cover. So the first one is that learning is a process of self-organisation and problem solving. As a coach or a teacher, you just can't take a file that's in your head and transfer it straight to the head of your athlete or your learner. They have to create that new skill and knowledge for themselves. So we have to create situations where they can develop that knowledge. Now sometimes that might mean telling them something, but there's no guarantee about what you've told them is the same thing that they will get. In fact, it's guaranteed to be different in some ways. And words are useful, but they're not the only tool you've got. So learning is about problem solving and self-organisation. There's something that the athlete or the player has to do, and they do it in response to the prevailing conditions and arrangements that we provide as coaches. So that's the words we say, but also the activities we create and the rules and conditions around those activities. The next thing, and this is probably a really key point, and there's books about this. If you're really interested, there's a professor from America called Rob Gray who has a podcast called The Action Perception Podcast, which is worth listening to. But skilled movement always involves action and perception at the same time. Any volleyball skill you do is not just about doing something. You're doing something into response to something you see. If you're receiving serve, part of receiving serve is about perceiving the ball as it comes to you from the server. And that's probably harder than the actual action part where you put your hands and your arms in the right place. So having the technique is important, but it's not enough on its own. And in fact, the hardest parts of most skill technique is the perception part. So, you know, when you've got players who are learning to receive serve, most of them can probably put their arms straight and put their thumbs together and squeeze their shoulders and all those sorts of things. But a lot of them have trouble perceiving where the ball's coming from. And we can't separate those two things apart. They're all part of the skill. So when we develop skills and techniques, we always have to involve in action and perception coupling. Because in essence, this can be the hardest part that people have to learn, and it's the part we tend to remove when we want them to develop skills, if they can develop it some other way and then add these bits later. So they have to know where to be, they have to know their movement of the ball, they have to know where the others are on the court and things like that. So if you're ever doing service reception drills, for example, I would always have two passes. Now they're going to get less reps obviously, but by having two passes they have to decide whose ball it is for a start. I would always try and have the ball coming over the net, because that's the perception, that's what they have to perceive in the game. So a really key point, something we can develop further later, but this action perception coupling is really important, and when students, players and athletes develop motor skills, they should be developing them both at the same time. The other thing is movement always occurs in what we call an athlete environment symmetry. So whenever you move in volleyball, you are always responding to the environment. You're not just moving for the sake of it. So even as something which is semi-closed like a serve is always conditioned by a range of things. For example, the dimensions of the court, the height of the net. You can't smack the ball at 100 miles an hour 1 metre off the ground, because the net determines that the environment, which is the net in this case, determines it has to be a certain height. You have to hit it a certain distance to get it in the opponent's court. But also things like who you're playing will determine where you might serve. You might want to serve it to someone you perceive to be a weaker receiver. You might want to push the setter around the court, or if you're on the beach, certainly you want to change where you serve from and what sort of serve you do, how much you do it, depending on the wind and other conditions like that. So any movement in volleyball and any other sport is always about the athlete and the environment symmetry. You always balance these things up. And so if we remove these things, we're actually not teaching athletes how to play game-like skills. We're teaching them skills which may not be particularly useful. An example from basketball, often we get kids just to shoot the ball. You know, you get kids who can shoot them endlessly, and then you put them in a game and they can't shoot because there's pressure on. Even something as closed as like a free throw. There's certainly been athletes who can drop free throws in the gym ad infinitum, but put them in a game when the pressure's on and all of a sudden they need to drop it to win the match and they miss it. What does this mean for training? Well, as much as we can at training and practice, we want the environment to be as game-like as possible. So for example, when we're teaching players to pass, almost never do you pass the ball straight back where it's come from. You move it to a different position. So I would always try and have the athletes working in at least a triangle shape or something like that, rather than just passing the ball back and forth. Now, this is something you will commonly see about the athlete environment symmetry. So if you've ever been to a kid's football or soccer game or training or basketball for that one, you'll see kids endlessly running around cones dribbling the ball. I don't know about you, but I've watched quite a lot of kids soccer or football. I've even watched quite a few games of kids basketball. I've never yet seen a cone on the court that people have to run around. So this is almost a useless training activity. In fact, I think it's dangerous because it actually makes them worse. So there are no cones on the court, so why would you practice dribbling around a cone? Apart from learning a skill that's all but useless, it actually teaches you worse things about ball control, because what it teaches you to do is to drop your vision down to your feet. Now, if you're playing any of these sorts of sports, the problem is there's an opponent, and to see the opponent you can't look at your feet, you've got to have your field of vision in front of you. So how can we in these sorts of sports have drills which would look more like a game? Now at the very least, instead of a cone, I'd have other kids standing there and they have to dribble around the kids. They have to keep looking up, not just looking at their feet all the time. Otherwise we're training them to do the technique in the incorrect way, which might be fun for training but has no implication for the game at all. And you can probably think of some equivalent drills and tasks that we do in volleyball. So for example, peppering. Is that really teaching? Is it just a warm-up thing, but what are you teaching them to do? You're probably teaching them to pass the ball straight back where it's came from in a distance equal to where it's come from. Almost never happens in a game. So thinking about training and helping athletes develop skills within an athlete environment symmetry, which involves this perception and action coupling. The other point is, and particularly perhaps for some of us who are a bit older, that when we first learned to do coaching and things like that, we got taught this thing called part whole. You teach the kids to do all the little bits and then you put it all together. So you break it all down. So you might see in volleyball, kids standing there on a box and hitting the ball just like this. Now the problem is they can learn to hit the ball really well off a box, but it actually has no transfer at all to the skill. Now something like spiking in volleyball is quite a complex skill, but if you separate it into its parts, those parts don't then get stitched back together into a whole. Now it doesn't mean you have to do the whole thing together, but you have to have a meaningful whole. So for example, for beginners when they're learning to spike, I would always have them run, jump and hit high. And I might have my feedback always quite specific about one thing, or I might want them to focus on one thing, but I'd always get them to do the whole. I wouldn't break it down into smaller things. When we've got more advanced athletes who can already hit, then the next thing I'd always make them do is transition and then hit, because they just tend to stand where they are and hit from there. So they'd be in a passing position or a defensive position wherever they should be, and whether they played the ball or not, the next thing to do is to transition before they hit. So a meaningful thing for them to do is to be ready to receive or cover or whatever they're doing, transition and then hit the ball. If it's a setter, I would always have them receiving off a passed ball, because the first thing a setter has to do is get into position, have their hands ready, and they need to look at where the pass is coming from. So if someone's just tossing the ball in all the time, you've reduced part of the skill, an important part of the perceptual skill, and they're not developing a skill they can actually use in the game. One of the phrases you'll hear from some of these people who've been researching this field is having repetition without repetition. So because we know that every single performance of a skill is different, there's little point in just grooving one single perfect technique all the time, because you'll never use it. So people talk about muscle memory, and it's a bit of a misnomer really, because every time in a game you do it, it's never the same. You're never doing the same thing again. So if you have this specific muscle memory, it's a specific muscle memory for something you won't use. Now in a general sense, there's worthwhile doing lots of repetitions, but that repetition must be repetition with variability. So it's not the same thing every time. So for example, if you want to train a setter, maybe you'd have them, a passed ball coming in, they'd have to come in from position one, and then they'd set it, and you'd have like 4 or 5 different people coming through. Someone who's shorter, someone who's taller, someone who hits the ball high and hard, someone who hits the ball lower. So they have to always adjust their technique because the person is hitting. Setting the ball is not about just putting the ball in the same spot every time, it's putting it somewhere in response to the hitter is. So it's about having whole and connected movements, which involve that perception-action coupling. As much as possible, we want to have game and game-like situations in our training sessions and our practices, so athletes develop games and skills they'll actually use in the game, not some perfected technique that's not game-like at all. Right, we're going through this pretty quick, so if you want more information, like I said, you can see one of the senior coaches at the club to help you out. But the last bit we want to talk quickly about is cues and feedback. So there's the 4 things we want to cover. The first one is less is more. So first of all, sometimes you want to focus on what the athletes can do. And you want to focus on that and help them just give points about that. Encouragement, I would think, depending on the age and the level of the athletes, but But sort of somewhere between 50 and 90% of your coaching has to be encouragement rather than instruction. The second thing is we want to say less rather than more. If we give them a whole long tirade of information, they won't remember any of it anyway. And then what you want to finish with after you've given your short thing is one key cue to finish with. And just one cue at a time. So if you tell them, if you have a timeout, say in the middle of a game, and you give them 5 things, you talk about 5 things. Well, they won't remember all 5 things, but what they will probably see it as, and each individual athlete might be different, is they'll see it as a smorgasbord of things they can pick and choose from, and they'll pick and choose one of those 5 things they want to do. So you're better off just to focus on the one or maybe the 2 things that are really important at that time. And just give them one cue at a time. So what we mean by this is we want to tell them what we want them to do, not what we want them not to do. So for example, if you've got some kids spiking, rather than saying don't hit it in the net, say hit it high and deep. And high and deep is the cue. You're telling them what you want them to do. If you tell them what not to do, if you say don't hit it in the net, well, by implication, it doesn't matter if you hit it under the net or straight back at your setter or anywhere. What you want to do is say what you want them to do and give them one cue to do it. So it might be hit high and hard, or it might be hit deep, or something like that, but just one cue. So then while you're in the middle of the game, they won't remember a 2-minute thesis on how to hit the ball. You know, you should run in this way, and then and when the ball's up there, reach high. And you just say high and hard, and that one cue captures everything. And personally, I think it's important that during game situations particularly, but even at training, give very little information during performance, because they won't take it in anyway. If you've got an athlete learning to do something or developing something, I would let them do it at least 5 times before I give any feedback. And then I'd find out what they think before I tell them what I think. When do you step in and say something? Well, remember we talked about learning being a process of self-organisation and problem solving. But you know that sometimes athletes get frustrated because they're just not improving. They just can't get it. And this is the time when you might step in and say, okay, here's something I really want you to focus on. This is where you can intervene and prompting and nudging them towards a particular thing with some more direct instruction. But the purpose of doing it is just nudging them so they'll keep problem solving and self-organising towards improving, because you cannot put a file straight from your brain into their brain. So if they're still exploring, if they're still trying stuff out, if they've got options, then I would tend to give very little feedback and just encourage them to keep trying to move forward. If you're interested in these sort of ideas, then I would look at the work of Nick Winkelman. He's got a website and a book and some other things that are worth looking at. The next thing is about internal and external cues. You probably already know about this, but internal cues relate specifically to the body. So what to do with your elbow, what to focus on, squeezing your arms together, put your elbow high, keep your chin down, or something like that. That's called an internal cue. It's internal to your body. External cues are things outside the body. Okay, so instead of saying jump high, you might say press into the floor, whip through that ball, something like that. Now, the internal language is useful for description, whereas external language is useful for coaching. It gives you something that you can picture and work towards rather than trying to think internally about something, which is quite difficult to change. If any of you play golf and you're playing with someone, what's the best way to put them off the game? Well, when they get on the tee, you just ask them, oh, what do you do with your hands? How are your hands placed? And all of a sudden, instead of focusing on the ball and the target down the fairway, they're focusing right here on their hands, and their focus is not on the part of the performance that's important. So in golf, often you'll say things like sweep the ball off the tee, which is much more useful than saying keep your hands tight and together and swing through. Things that are external. And also things like metaphors are much more powerful because they can bring together a whole range of things. Metaphors are much easily remembered in action because in the moment you need something cue or a metaphor that quickly binds together a whole range of things. So a common one we hear is, when kids are learning to serve overarm, we say things like, left arm high, right arm back, elbow by the ear, etc., etc. But in the end, we just want to say something like bow and arrow, which captures all those things together. And when we say bow and arrow, the kids know, oh, that means all those things, but they can't think of all those things at the same time. So a metaphor is a powerful tool of giving information very quickly and while they're performing, whether it's at training or in the game. Now, using metaphors can be useful when you're trying to help students or athletes develop in particular environments. Remembering that it's always a relationship between the athlete and the environment. So therefore, if we want to develop an athlete's performance, we need to set up environments that will encourage that to happen. Sometimes this is called a constraints-led approach. But I just want to give one example. All right, so we might have an athlete who's who needs to jump high for their float serve. They're just sort of running forward. So what we could do is change the environment in training. We could put a physical barrier just inside the baseline. And that barrier to stop them jumping forward and getting them to jump up. And that could be a ball cart or something. Now the problem with that's quite useful. That changes the environment, which causes them to change and problem solve their action differently to make them jump higher rather than jump forward. But the problem is in a game you can't wheel out the ball cart onto the court. A lot of research has shown that in fact if you have an imagined or pictured metaphor barrier rather than a physical one, it works equally well. So you might say to the athlete when they come back to serve, all right, remember we're going to want to jump higher. So as you're coming into serve, there's a brick wall right there in front of you, just inside the baseline. Can you see it? It's right there, that brick wall. Don't jump into the brick wall. We want you to jump up. We don't want you to jump forward into that brick wall. Can you see that brick wall? Something like that works exactly the same way that the ball cart would work. Now, this is not a recipe. You might have someone who wants to do this and you try the brick wall and it doesn't work. So you need to find something else because the metaphors, the cues, the environmental changes don't work for every athlete. You've got to find what works for them. Because just like an athlete's development is about problem solving, so it is for you as a coach. Learning to coach is about problem solving. You try things with athletes, you try something else. It's always modifying what you do. Just an example. So the main thing is when we're giving our language and our cues that we use, it's about promoting movement, not to facilitate cognitive development. So in the end, they will develop a mental model of something, but we're not really interested in that. We're interested in how they perform. So any language we use that's visual or tactile or sensory or is about in space is much more useful than something which is cognitive. Personally, I don't see any point in saying to an athlete, can you describe your movement? Tell me how you served? Because that shifts them internally into their head. But we want them to do the movement. Right? They're not going to write a thesis on the movement of a float serve. They're going to do it. So we want them to show us things. And the language we use should help them to do it, not to just necessarily think or describe it per se. All right, lastly, the applications. If learning to coach is also a process of problem solving and self-organisation, then all this information we've given you is just ideas and you're going to take it and work it out for yourself. There's been a lot of research and thinking done about coaching and no one knows what the one correct way to coach is. It's always a response to the athletes in front of you, the sport you're playing, the ability and level of the competition you're in, your personality, the athlete's personality. There is no one correct way to coach. So we're not telling you this is a recipe. We're just trying to prompt you to think about how athletes learn. But coaching is about developing environments and giving limited cues. So athletes themselves will learn by problem solving and self-organising. This is because this is the way people learn anything. So when you think about it, what you've got coaching coming up, what might you do? How might you create environments to help athletes develop skills in a certain way? So thanks for listening. I hope you weren't too bored. Sorry that this isn't like a top TV production video, but I hope the information is useful for you. All the best.